Speed it up. I already wired the down payment. That was what I heard my daughter-in-law whisper beside my husband's casket, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hymn playing softly in the background. The church smelled of fresh lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you leave. Richard had always loved this church. We were married here 48 years ago. Now, I was standing exactly 12 feet from the altar where we once said our vows, staring at the satin lining of a coffin that held the man who built my entire adult life. I did not turn around when I heard her. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I simply listened. If we wait too long, the lake house will be gone, Lindsay added, her heels clicking lightly against the marble floor as she shifted her weight. My son, Ethan, murmured something I couldn't quite catch. It didn't matter. His silence told me enough. The organ continued to play Amazing Grace, and friends from our neighborhood in Fairfield dabbed their eyes with folded tissues. I kept mine dry. Grief had drained me for 3 days straight, but in that moment something inside me settled into a stillness I had never known before. I folded my hands over my black gloves and looked at Richard's photograph propped beside the casket. He was smiling in that picture, the same steady smile he wore the day we paid off our mortgage, the day Ethan graduated from college, the day he told me, "Maggie, I made sure you'll never have to depend on anyone." I remember thinking at the time that it was just another sweet promise from a careful husband. Now, standing in 3-inch heels that pinched my swollen feet, I began to understand he might have meant more. The receiving line moved slowly. People hugged me, their wool coats brushing against my sleeves, whispering how strong I was. I nodded politely. Lindsay stepped forward at last, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. Her black dress was tailored perfectly, not a wrinkle in sight. "We'll handle the paperwork this week," she said softly, eyes glossy but dry. "You shouldn't have to worry about a thing." I met her gaze then. Blue, steady, impatient. I gave her a small smile. "You're right," I said. "I won't worry." The word surprised even me. Outside, the November air was crisp, just under 50 degrees, the kind of cold that clears your head. As the hearse door closed and the procession prepared to leave for the cemetery 5 miles away, I stood very still on the church steps. I had spent 48 years beside a man who planned for storms before clouds ever formed. Lindsay thought she was racing a clock. What she didn't know was that the clock had been set long before she ever started timing it. And for the first time since Richard's heart gave out in our kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, I was no longer thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what he had left behind. The house felt larger when we returned from the cemetery, as if the walls had quietly stepped back to make room for the absence. The November light slipped through the tall windows in the living room, pale and thin, settling over the leather armchair where Richard used to read the Sunday paper. His coffee mug was still on the side table, a faint ring dried at the bottom. I had not had the heart to rinse it. Ethan stood near the fireplace, scrolling through his phone with the careful focus of someone avoiding eye contact. Lindsay moved through the room with gentle efficiency, removing sympathy cards from the entryway table and stacking them neatly, as though tidying could soften what had just happened. "You should rest, Margaret," she said, her tone wrapped in silk. "We can start organizing the documents tomorrow. There's a lot to review." I removed my gloves slowly and placed them on the console table. "Tomorrow is fine," I answered. My voice sounded steady, almost detached, as if it belonged to someone observing from across the room. Ethan cleared his throat. "Dad kept everything in the office, right?" he asked. He did not look at me when he said it. I nodded once. The office door was closed, just as Richard had left it the morning he did not come back from the kitchen. I remembered the way he had paused in the doorway that day, turning slightly as if he had forgotten something. Now I wondered if he had remembered everything. Lindsay walked toward the hallway, her heels softer against the hardwood here. She stopped in front of the office and rested her hand on the brass knob without opening it. "We should make sure the trust is activated properly," she said lightly. "These things can take weeks if you do not move quickly." Weeks. The word hung in the air. I looked at the framed photographs lining the wall. Ethan at age 6 with a missing front tooth. Our family at Lake Waverly 15 summers ago, sunlight flashing on the water behind us. Lindsay had not been in that picture. She came later, polished and determined, with spreadsheets and 5-year plans. Your father handled most of it himself, I said. He believed in timing. Lindsay smiled faintly. Timing is everything. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw a calculation beneath the sympathy. Not cruelty, not even impatience, just ambition. Ethan shifted his weight and finally looked at me. There was something uncertain there, something almost boyish. Mom, we just want to make this easier for you. I studied his face, the same slope of nose as Richard, the same deep-set eyes. Of course you do, I replied. The afternoon stretched quietly after that. Lindsay began listing tasks in a small leather planner, her pen moving quickly. Ethan carried the remaining flower arrangements into the kitchen. I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the faint scratch of ink on paper. They thought the process had begun. They did not realize it had begun long ago. I walked to the office door and turned the knob before Lindsay could. The room smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave. Richard's desk was immaculate as always. On the top drawer, the key rested exactly where he had told me it would be. I did not open the drawer yet. I simply closed the door behind me and let the silence settle. Grief had been loud these past few days. Now it was quiet, and in that quiet, I began to remember everything he had prepared. The key felt cool against my palm, lighter than I expected for something that carried so much weight. I sat down in Richard's leather chair and let my fingers rest on the edge of the desk before opening the top drawer. Outside the office window, the maple tree in our front yard trembled in the late afternoon breeze, its leaves half gone, clinging stubbornly to thin branches. It was almost 4 o'clock. Lindsay's voice drifted faintly down the hallway as she spoke to someone on her phone, her tone lowered but purposeful. Yes, we are moving quickly, she said. There should not be any delays. I did not need to hear the rest. I slid the drawer open. Inside, everything was arranged with his usual precision. A stack of manila folders labeled in black ink. Property, investments, insurance, and beneath them, a smaller envelope with my name written in a steady hand. Margaret, no flerish, no explanation, just my name. I did not open it yet. Instead, I lifted the first folder and scanned the dates. 6 months ago, 4 months ago, 2 months ago. He had been working quietly while I was planning our anniversary dinner, while Lindsay was hosting Sunday brunches and discussing market trends at the kitchen island. I heard a soft knock at the door before Lindsay entered without waiting for an answer. She stood just inside the office, careful not to step too far in. We were thinking it might help to contact the estate attorney first thing in the morning, she said gently. The sooner the assets are transferred, the less complicated it becomes. I looked up at her, still seated in Richard's chair. Transferred to whom? I asked calmly. She smiled, almost apologetic. To the appropriate beneficiaries, of course. That is how these things work. Appropriate. The word lingered. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly where it had been. Your father-in-law believed in preparation, I said. He did not like loose ends. Lindsay nodded, but I saw the impatience flicker across her face like a shadow passing over glass. We just want to make sure everything is secure, she replied. Secure. Another careful word. After she left, I finally opened the envelope with my name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. His handwriting filled the page. He wrote about trust, about timing, about making sure I never had a rush for anyone's convenience. At the bottom was a short sentence that made me pause. You are the executor. No one moves anything without you. I read it twice. Then a third time. Down the hallway, I could hear Ethan asking Lindsay whether the lake house paperwork had been updated online. The sound of her heels crossed the hardwood again, quick and certain. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For the first time since the hospital room had gone silent, I felt something stronger than grief. Not anger, not fear, clarity. They believed the process had already begun, that signatures would follow sympathy and that mourning would blur judgment. They did not know that nothing in this house moved without the key that now rested in my hand. And they did not yet understand that Richard had never left anything to chance. That night the house settled into a silence, so complete I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away. Ethan and Lindsay decided to stay over, insisting it would be better if I was not alone. I agreed without argument. From my bedroom window, I could see the driveway, where Richard used to park his sedan, the oil stain on the concrete still visible beneath the porch light. I sat at the edge of the bed and let the day replay in slow pieces. Lindsay's careful words, Ethan's hesitation, the way both of them spoke about assets as though they were seasonal decorations that needed to be packed and redistributed before winter. I removed my earrings and placed them in the small porcelain dish Richard brought back from Boston 15 years ago. He had handed it to me with a grin and said, "For the things that matter." At the time I thought he meant jewelry. Now I understood he had always been speaking about something else. The next morning I woke before sunrise, just after 5:30. The air carried a thin chill, 50 degrees at most, and the hardwood floors felt cold beneath my slippers. I brewed coffee the way Richard liked it, 2 scoops exactly, and poured a cup for myself. When Ethan entered the kitchen, his tie already knotted, he looked startled to see me dressed and composed. "You're up early," he said. I nodded. "There are things to review." Lindsay joined us moments later, her tablet tucked beneath her arm. She spoke with the brisk optimism of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. "I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Bennett for Thursday at 10 in the morning, she said. "If we can finalize the trust distribution quickly, we can avoid unnecessary complications." I stirred my coffee slowly. "Thursday works," I replied. Ethan seemed relieved. Lindsay smiled. "It is important to be proactive." After they left for work, the house returned to its steady quiet. I carried Richard's letter back to the office and read it again, this time more carefully. There were small details I had overlooked before. A reference to an amendment filed in late spring. A note about a separate trust established for specific property. And one sentence underlined lightly in blue ink. "Patience protects what urgency exposes." I leaned back in a chair and let that settle. Outside, a delivery truck rolled down the street, its brakes sighing as it passed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Yet beneath it all something had shifted. Lindsay believed speed would secure her future. Ethan believed cooperation would keep the peace. They both believed grief would make me pliable. They did not see that grief had sharpened me instead. I reached for the phone on the desk and dialed the number Richard had written in the margin of the letter. Mr. Bennett answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, almost expectant. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "I was wondering when you would call." I looked around the office once more at the shelves lined with decades of careful planning, at the framed certificates on the wall, at the maple tree outside shedding what it no longer needed. "I believe it is time," I said quietly. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt entirely awake. Thursday arrived with a pale gray sky and a steady wind that scattered dry leaves across the driveway as Ethan pulled his car out at 9:30 sharp. Lindsay rode beside him, her posture straight, her expression composed in the rearview mirror. I followed in my own sedan, keeping a measured distance as we drove the 15 miles into town. Mr. Bennett's office sat on the second floor of a red brick building near the courthouse, a place Richard had trusted for more than 20 years. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and old books, and a clock on the wall ticked with quiet authority. Lindsay checked her tablet while Ethan flipped through a stack of papers she had prepared. I kept my purse on my lap and watched the second hand move steadily forward. At 10 o'clock precisely, Mr. Bennett opened the door and greeted us with a solemn nod. His eyes lingered on me a moment longer than necessary, not out of pity, but recognition. We stepped into his conference room, where sunlight filtered through narrow blinds and cast thin lines across the polished table. Lindsay began speaking before we were fully seated. She explained how she believed an expedited transfer would minimize complications and ensure liquidity for certain investment opportunities. Her voice was confident, efficient, almost rehearsed. Ethan nodded along, occasionally glancing at me as though seeking approval. Mr. Bennett listened without interruption, his hands folded neatly before him. When she finished, the room settled into a brief silence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, turning toward me. "As executor, The timing and sequence of distribution are entirely under your authority. Lindsay's pen paused midair. Ethan shifted in his chair. I folded my hands calmly on the table. And what of the amendment filed in May? I asked. Mr. Bennett inclined his head slightly, as though he had been waiting for that question. He opened a folder and slid a document across the table toward me, first, not toward Ethan. The amendment established a separate trust for the lake property and designated specific conditions regarding access and transfer, he explained. Lindsay's composure faltered for just a second. Conditions? She asked, her tone tightening. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses. Yes, the property remains under the protection of the trust. It is not subject to immediate sale, nor can it be leveraged without the consent of the primary beneficiary. Ethan looked confused. And who is that? He asked quietly. Mr. Bennett met my gaze before answering. Your mother. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm. Lindsay's fingers tightened around her pen, though her smile remained fixed. There must be some misunderstanding, she said. We were under the impression that all assets would transition equally. Mr. Bennett's voice stayed even. Your father anticipated the need for clarity. I reached for the document and skimmed the familiar signature at the bottom. Richard's handwriting had never wavered. Outside the window, a gust of wind rattled the glass briefly before fading. I felt no rush, no urgency, only the quiet certainty that comes when preparation meets patience. Lindsay had believed speed would secure control. Instead, she had revealed how little she understood the man whose estate she was so eager to manage. I placed the document back on the table and looked at my son, whose expression had softened into something uncertain, almost vulnerable. There is no misunderstanding, I said calmly, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw the balance of power shift without a single raised voice. We left Mr. Bennett's office just before 11:30, the late morning sun brighter now, but carrying none of the warmth Lindsay had expected when we first arrived. The sidewalk outside the brick building was lined with bare trees, their branches thin and exposed against the pale sky. Ethan walked beside me in silence, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat. Lindsay kept pace on his other side, her heels striking the pavement with controlled precision. She did not speak until we reached the parking lot. There must be additional documents, she said carefully, as though negotiating a minor inconvenience. Your father would not have structured everything without ensuring equal distribution. I unlocked my car and turned to face her. Your father-in-law structured everything exactly as he intended, I replied evenly. Ethan looked from her to me, confusion clouding his features. Mom, why would Dad separate the lake house? He asked. His voice was softer now, less certain than it had been in the conference room. I held his gaze for a moment before answering. Because he knew the value of patience, I said, and he understood that property is not only about money. Lindsay inhaled slowly, forcing composure back into place. We were only trying to make this efficient, she insisted. Opportunities do not wait. I offered a small, polite smile. Neither does character, I said quietly. The drive home felt longer than the 15 miles it had taken earlier. Ethan stared out the window of their car ahead of me at every red light, his reflection faint in the glass. When we pulled into the driveway, Lindsay stepped out first and walked toward the house with brisk determination, as though reclaiming ground simply by entering it. Inside, she moved directly to the kitchen island and opened her tablet again, scrolling with quick flicks of her finger. There may be clauses regarding liquidity that we have not reviewed, she said without looking up. Ethan remained near the doorway, watching me instead. I removed my coat and hung it carefully in the closet. There's also a moral provision attached to the trust, I added calmly. Lindsay's hand paused. A moral provision, she repeated, her voice tightening despite her effort to sound neutral. I walked to the sink and rinsed my hands slowly beneath warm water. Your father-in-law believed that inheritance reflects conduct, I explained. Respect was never optional in this family. The kitchen grew very still. The only sound was the steady drip from the faucet before I turned it off. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? He asked. I dried my hands with a linen towel and faced them both. It means timing matters, I said. But so do words spoken when someone believes no one is listening. Lindsay's composure flickered again, just for a heartbeat. She straightened her shoulders. Are you suggesting something? She asked. I met her eyes evenly. I'm stating that your father-in-law prepared for every possibility, I replied. The late afternoon light shifted across the hardwood floor, casting long shadows toward the hallway that led to Richard's office. Nothing had been raised in volume. Nothing had been overtly accused. Yet the air between us had changed. Lindsay believed she had encountered a procedural obstacle. She had not yet realized she had triggered something far more deliberate. And as I watched her calculate her next move, I understood that patience was no longer a virtue. It was an advantage. That evening, the temperature dropped into the low 40s, and the house responded with soft creaks as the heating system adjusted to the cold. Lindsay remained unusually quiet through dinner, pushing her food around her plate, while Ethan attempted light conversation about work, about traffic on the interstate, about anything that did not involve trust documents or moral provisions. I listened without interruption, nodding at the appropriate moments. After we finished, Lindsay gathered the plates with controlled efficiency and disappeared into the kitchen. I could hear cabinet doors opening and closing with slightly more force than necessary. Ethan lingered at the table. Mom, he said finally, lowering his voice, did Dad ever mention concerns about how things would be handled? I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate before answering. Your father mentioned many things, I replied. Most of them were about responsibility. Ethan looked down at his hands. Lindsay just wants stability, he said. We both do. I studied his face in the soft yellow light above the dining table. He was no longer the boy from the photograph in the hallway. Yet in moments like this, I could still see the uncertainty beneath the confidence he tried to project. Stability is not the same as control, I said gently. Lindsay re-entered the room then, drying her hands on a towel. I think we should schedule another meeting with Mr. Bennett, she said, her tone polite but firm. There may be additional interpretations of the clause you mentioned. I met her gaze without blinking. There is no interpretation required, I said calmly. It is quite clear. A silence settled between us, heavy but restrained. Lindsay set the towel down with deliberate care. If this is about something I said at the service, she began, her voice measured, you may have misunderstood the context. I tilted my head slightly. Context rarely changes intention, I replied. Ethan looked startled. What was said at the service? He asked, his eyes shifting from her to me. Lindsay's composure wavered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. We were discussing logistics, she said quickly. Nothing inappropriate. I rose from my chair slowly, feeling the weight of the moment without allowing it to press against me. Logistics have their place, I said. So does respect. The clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing softly through the house Richard had built with steady hands and patient planning. Lindsay's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Later, as I passed the office door on my way upstairs, I paused and rested my hand against the wood. Inside, the files remained exactly as I'd left them. Prepared. Protected. The air in the house felt different now. Not tense, but alert, as though every wall understood that something irreversible had begun. Lindsay believed this was a misunderstanding that could be negotiated. Ethan believed peace could be restored with enough explanation. They did not yet understand that some words, once spoken, rearrange everything. And as I turned off the lights and climbed the staircase slowly, I knew that the next move would not be theirs to make. The following morning broke clear and cold, the sky a hard shade of blue that left no room for softness. I woke before 6 and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard shifted, then settled. I rose, dressed carefully in a navy sweater and pressed slacks, and brushed my hair with steady strokes. In the mirror, I did not see a grieving widow. I saw a woman who understood the value of timing. When I stepped into the kitchen, Lindsay was already there, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. She turned slightly when she saw me, lowering her voice further. We may need to adjust the offer, she said into the receiver. The transfer is not as straightforward as we thought. She ended the call and forced a polite smile. Just reviewing options, she said lightly. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. Options are useful, I replied. Assumptions are not. Ethan entered a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes, unaware of the conversation that had just ended. I've been thinking, he said, looking between us. Maybe we should slow everything down. Give it a few weeks. Lindsay's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Delays create complications, she answered, especially in real estate. I met her gaze. The lake house is not available for immediate sale, I said calmly. Nor will it be. She crossed her arms, maintaining composure but unable to hide the edge beneath her words. You cannot expect us to put our lives on hold indefinitely. I set my cup down gently. Your lives are not on hold, I said. Only your expectations. Silence filled the room, not loud, not explosive, just dense. Ethan shifted uneasily. Mom, what exactly are you planning? He asked. I walked to the hallway and returned with a slim folder I had prepared the night before. I placed it on the kitchen island between us. I met with Mr. Bennett privately yesterday afternoon, I said evenly. Lindsay's posture stiffened. Privately, she repeated. I nodded. The moral provision attached to the trust is not symbolic. It is enforceable. Any beneficiary who demonstrates conduct detrimental to the well-being of the primary executor may have their distribution reviewed. Ethan's face paled slightly. Reviewed how? He asked. I held his gaze. Reduced, deferred, or redirected. Lindsay's hand rested on the edge of the island, her knuckles faintly white. This is excessive, she said quietly. You are reacting emotionally. I shook my head once. I am reacting intentionally. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking each second with impartial precision. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, ordinary life continuing without pause. Lindsay opened the folder and scanned the document inside, her eyes moving quickly until they slowed near. The final paragraph. Her breath caught, barely noticeable, but I saw it. The trust required a formal review of any request for accelerated liquidation made within 30 days of the decedent's passing. Documentation of intent would be considered. Words spoken in public settings could be submitted as evidence. She closed the folder carefully, as though sudden movement might make the language disappear. Ethan looked at her, confusion turning gradually into realization. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stood there, steady and composed. Lindsay had believed that speed would secure her future. Instead, it had documented her impatience. And as the morning light stretched across the kitchen floor, I understood that the advantage no longer rested with those who moved first, but with the one who had been listening all along. The house remained unusually quiet after Lindsay closed the folder. No door slammed. No voices rose. Ethan stood still, his eyes moving from the document to me and back again, as if recalibrating something he had assumed was fixed. Lindsay straightened her shoulders and slid the papers neatly back into place, her movements careful, controlled. So what happens now? She asked, her tone composed but thinner than before. I walked to the window and looked out at the maple tree in the front yard. Nearly all of its leaves had fallen, leaving the branches exposed against the pale afternoon sky. Now, I said calmly, we proceed correctly. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a habit he had carried since childhood whenever he felt uncertain. Mom, are you planning to block everything? He asked. I turned to face him. I am planning to honor your father's intentions, I replied. Nothing more, nothing less. Lindsay stepped closer to the island, her expression measured. If this is about what you believe you heard at the service, she said carefully, then let me clarify. I was trying to ensure financial stability for our future. I held her gaze steadily. Your future is not endangered, I said, but it is not entitled to acceleration. The distinction settled heavily between us. Ethan exhaled slowly. I did not realize there were conditions like this, he admitted. I nodded once. Your father did not advertise his safeguards, I said. He implemented them. The room felt different now, not tense but balanced. The urgency that had colored Lindsay's movements for days seemed to have drained away, replaced by calculation of a different kind. She looked at Ethan, then back at me. "And if we choose to wait?" she asked. I folded my hands lightly in front of me. "Then the trust distributes according to schedule," I answered. "In time, with respect." Outside, a gust of wind brushed the branches against the siding, a soft scraping sound that faded as quickly as it came. Ethan looked toward the hallway that led to his father's office. "Dad really thought of everything," he said quietly. I felt a small, steady warmth rise in my chest. "He thought of character," I corrected gently. Lindsay drew in a slow breath. "We will wait," she said at last. There was no apology in her voice, but there was recognition. I inclined my head slightly. "That would be wise." The afternoon light stretched long across the hardwood floor, reaching almost to the base of the staircase. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No shouting, no ultimatums, only documents, timing, and the quiet exposure of intent. Ethan moved closer to me, his expression softer than it had been in days. "I'm sorry if we made this harder," he said. I studied him for a moment, seeing not the businessman or the husband, but the child who once asked permission before taking anything from the cookie jar. "Grief makes people reveal themselves," I said calmly. "It does not create them." Lindsay remained silent, her posture composed but subdued. The advantage had shifted without spectacle, without raised voices, without accusation. As evening approached and the house settled once more into its steady rhythm, I realized something important. I had not fought for control. I had simply refused to surrender it. And in that refusal, I had honored both the man who prepared for storms and the woman who finally understood how to stand in one.